Hey guys, I'm going to start by going over the Chapter 15 notes here. Chapter 15 covers the federal bureaucracy. The federal bureaucracy falls within the executive branch of government. These are agencies and cabinet departments that are all overseen ultimately by the president. That's where it kind of fits in this institutions piece. It is technically part of the executive branch. Um, so if you have ever seen Zootopia, there's a scene where they go to the DMV. If you want to take a look at that or watch it, it's kind of a funny clip. You can just Google DMV sloth scene from Zootopia. It maybe exaggerates, but shows some of the frustrations that people often have with bureaucratic agencies like the Department of Motor Vehicles, which is an example of a state agency. Um, so I want you guys to briefly think about, there's a box on your note packet asking you this. What is your experience with places like the US Post Office or the DMV? The US Post Office would be an example of a federal bureaucratic agency, while the DMV, like I said, falls within that state realm. But in general, what do your experiences at those places look like? What's the job of the employees? Does it seem like there's a lot of rules and procedures? In general, do you have positive or negative experiences there? All right. So, couple key questions here. Sometimes today the bureaucracy is referred to as the fourth branch of government. Now, the bureaucracy is not written into the Constitution anywhere, but it's a precedent that's set by George Washington when he has a cabinet department that includes the Secretary of State, the Secretary of the Treasury, and then also the US Post Office within his bureaucracy. The bureaucracy has only continued to grow as years have gone on. The size of the federal bureaucracy explodes following the New Deal. At this time, we had just gone through two world wars, right? Or we're in the Second World War. We had gone through the Great Depression. We had all these New Deal changes. We had Great Society legislation that follows, and all of these different initiatives expand government power. And that expansion of government power creates a need for administrative agencies within the executive branch to carry out this super dense legislation. So these appointed officials are in charge of making and administering policy within the power of the executive to enforce law. Now, the actual size and scope of the federal bureaucracy today, we have about 3 million people that work directly for a bureaucratic agency. So these are people that are bringing home government paychecks. But today, we live in a time where the government actually shops out a lot of the roles and responsibilities of administering policy to private businesses. And so those government contracts essentially give government jobs to private business, which can sometimes be more efficient, other times not. And so it's estimated that about 15 million people today work indirectly for the federal government, either because they work under a government contract, or if you're a university professor, you're receiving like grant money to do your research. They could even work for state and local agencies that help carry out programs like Medicaid or Medicare, so on and so forth. Now, one of the number one complaints of the bureaucracy is that they're inefficient and they're costly. And there have been numerous efforts by presidents in the past to change that. The irony of that is that every time we put together some sort of review board to look at whether or not the bureaucracy is efficient or whether or not all the money that they're spending is required. Every bureaucratic agency is interested in protecting itself and its employees, and more often than not, that bureaucratic review board or that internal review comes back saying, no, we're using our resources well here. And so all we've done is actually increased, for the time being, the size of the bureaucracy, made them less efficient, made them cost more, and that has continued to be a trend as presidents have talked about cutting things. Now, red tape is maybe something that you've heard of before. If not, red tape means we have excessive adherence to rules and procedures. Now, most of us from a consumer perspective are used to having the rules bent for us to some degree, right? If you have special circumstances, they will make exceptions for you, right? That's kind of the expectation in customer service. But when it comes to the bureaucracy, that is not the case, right? I went to the DMV last fall to renew my license, and I had just had an address change. My license needed to be renewed because it was my birthday, and I wanted to get the real ID. The real ID is the one that will allow you to fly without a passport domestically. So I did all of these things, and I had all of this documentation with me, but some of my documentation had my old address on it, and some of it did not. And so I expected, like, I'm here for an address change. There's going to be discrepancies in my address, but that wasn't going to work for the DMV, right? Because they had these excessive rules and these procedures they needed to follow. And so I needed to actually get a different ID printed with my new address so that that newly printed ID could be used as like my third form of identification to get the real ID. So while I was there, they literally like printed me a new ID and then threw it in the trash and printed me a real ID, which is totally not efficient at all, right? Cost-wise, it makes no sense. So in those sorts of instances, red tape can be really bad. But some rules and procedures are necessary, right? We have rules within the government that requires bureaucratic agencies to keep strict financial records, right? Ultimately, the taxpayers are the ones that are paying for all of the things the bureaucracy is doing. So requiring strict financial records keeps them more accountable to taxpayers, right? So those sorts of things aren't bad. All right. So a bureaucracy is a large, complex administrative structure that handles the everyday business of an organization. Now, bureaucracies are not specific to the federal government. They are found wherever there are large organizations, right? Corporations like McDonald's and Walt Disney and Twitter and Facebook and all of these corporations have this administrative structure, right? If I have an issue with Facebook, I'm not getting a sit-down meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, right? There are people under him that have this administrative role. All right, before I talk about the functions here, I want to talk about some of the principles of the federal bureaucracy. So in the federal bureaucracy, as well as most other administrative structures or corporations, you have this hierarchical authority. So authority looks kind of like a pyramid. In the federal bureaucracy, you have the president at the top, and then under him, you have your cabinet departments, right? Your secretaries of defense and of state, and so on and so forth. And then within those departments, you have smaller agencies, and so on and so forth. So you have this pyramid structure. Within the pyramid structure, you have job specialization. So you have a division of labor where there's specific duties for each individual person, right? Specific responsibilities. Um, then we have rules and regulations. So we have regulations, we have procedures for facilitation of any given job. There's limited discretionary authority. So discretionary authority is the extent to which bureaucrats can choose their course of action without it being laid out by law, right? In this specific instance, how would I carry out that um, issue, right? How would I solve that issue? And sometimes they don't have the authority to sort of go outside of their box. They would need to call over a manager or someone that maybe has more discretionary authority than them. All right, and then below that, it just again goes over kind of the responsibility of the different branches of government when it comes to rules and regulations. So the legislative branch is largely in charge of rulemaking, although they've passed off some of that responsibility to the executive branch. The executive has rule administration, so they're going to enforce the rules, make regulations, and then the judicial branch, much like they do with any sort of law, is going to review the rules, right? Rule adjudication. All right, so 3 main examples of the federal or functions of the federal bureaucracy. You have implementation. So this is their responsibility to carry out the laws of Congress as well as the executive orders of the president. So the Department of Education, for example, oversees implementation of the Every Student Succeeds Act, piece of federal education legislation, right? There's also administrative work. So this is routine administrative work, usually providing services to taxpayers. This is the function that we are probably most familiar with from a consumer side of things, right? So the Social Security Administration sends out Social Security checks to beneficiaries every month, right? That's their job. And then you have regulations. So they're going to issue rules and regulations, and ultimately these are going to impact the public, right? So the EPA, they set clean air standards. They don't need an act of Congress to do that because in the original act that created them, Congress gave them the authority to do that. Same thing with like the FDA, right? Bureaucratic organizations like the FDA are talking about things like vaping and do we allow for flavored like pods or do they just have to be tobacco flavored, right? Those sorts of things. So those rules and regulations will have an impact on the public. All right, so kind of a general history here. Like I said, constitutionally speaking, the bureaucracy does not exist. But starting in the early constitutional period, you have a small number of agencies and positions, right? Jefferson is our first Department of State Secretary, and then Hamilton at the Department of the Treasury, as well as the U.S. Post Office. At this time, selections for these positions are based on qualifications, as well as political affiliation to some degree, right? You weren't going to sit on Washington's cabinet if you weren't a supporter of Washington. All right, so in the early constitutional period, we have, like I said, to some degree, political affiliation and who you support does matter in getting these higher up positions within the bureaucracy. We call that the patronage system. So this is the practice of giving civil service jobs to political supporters, also sometimes called the spoils system. And the spoils system really ramps up under Andrew Jackson, right, following his election in 1828. And this becomes concerning to the American people because people are getting jobs based on their relationship with the people that are in office and not their merits, right? So they pass what's called the Pendleton Act and the Civil Service Act of 1883. The civil service, or the bureaucracy, was intended to be a meritocracy, right? It's about what you know, not who you know. So a merit system is created or reinforced under the Civil Service Act. This includes like competitive exams to get jobs. The goal was to limit partisan politics. These acts made it illegal to fire or demote civil servants for political causes. And then it also established another bureaucratic agency called the Civil Service Commission to enforce. So they created the rules and regulations of the act and actually enforced it. Now, as I mentioned, agencies grew substantially due to New Deal programs, the Great Society, the Cold War, and other wars and global conflicts. The government was now expected to have an active role in both economic and social programs. In 1939, Congress passes the Hatch Act, which is a further effort to make the bureaucracy non-political. So the Hatch Act actually, in its original form, limits political activities while on duty, the use of positions within the bureaucracy to campaign, anything like that. Parts of the Hatch Act are later overturned due to free speech violations, but it does still exist to some degree. Then you have the Civil Service Reform Act of 1978. This is a response to Watergate and widespread mistrust of the government in the years following. And this act abolishes the Civil Service Commission, which, as we mentioned, was created under the Pendleton Act, and it replaces this commission with 3 new agencies. They actually wanted to, within this realm, create division of power. So it establishes the Office of Personnel Management. This is like HR for the civil service, for bureaucratic workers. It also established government employee classifications, salaries, training, recruitment programs, all of those things. Now, under power and justification, your sheet says regulation and deregulation. All you need to know on this is that there have been periods of both, but more often than not, regulations stick around. Right? President Trump ran on a platform point that he would downsize the size of the federal bureaucracy. He would peel back some regulations, especially on business, and he did do that to some degree. But there have been many other realms where he's actually grown the size of the bureaucracy too. Now, when it comes to the patronage system, one of the areas where that still exists in the modern bureaucracy is in political appointments, right? All of your heads of the bureaucracy, those cabinet secretaries, are selected by the president. So yes, you should be an expert in your area because you're going to get grilled by the Senate about whether or not you qualify to be in that position. But you also need to be a strong supporter of the president to have that position. Within the bureaucracy today, there have been a ton of technological developments like we've seen in all other industries. But technological developments globally have also led to the growth of government, right? Now we need to oversee things like cybersecurity, right? And that growth in technology has resulted in growth of regulation and just bureaucratic agencies in general. We also have become a more and more globalized society, means the Department of State, which works on our diplomatic issues, has continued to grow, so on and so forth. Now, all of these like bureaucratic bills that Congress has passed have attempted to make it less partisan, and one part of that is making it difficult for someone to be terminated from their job within the bureaucracy. So there are actually numerous steps that are required to ultimately fire a government employee. That employee needs at least 30 days written notice that they're going to be let go with a statement of reasons as to why, including specific examples of that employee maybe violating norms or going outside of their role within their job. Um, the employee has the right to an attorney and the right to appeal and reply to the charges. Um, they get to have a hearing with legal counsel present. They have the right to appeal all the way up to the U.S. Court of Appeals. So it's not easy to fire anyone. That has its pros and cons, of course, as well. Now, the bureaucracy today is made up of about 2.7 million civil servants. These are the people who work for the public sector, the government. The president only appoints 3% of these positions, and this is based on the patronage system or political appointments, rather. Today we have 15 cabinet level positions, with the most recent one being added by George W. Bush. The Department of Homeland Security is added after 9/11. We have over 220 independent agencies with 2,000 plus bureaus, divisions, and branches. So those would be like the offices within the states. Three biggest departments or agencies. Number one is the Department of Defense, followed by the U.S. Postal Service, and then the Veterans Administration, or the VA. The size of the federal bureaucracy, as far as number of civil servants goes, has remained stable since 1960, right around 2.7 to 3 million people. But like I said, there's been this turn towards granting government contracts and giving some of those positions to state and local agencies or private firms. So there's like 13 to 15 million people that are working for the government indirectly now. That is not the case in 1960. Now, the power of the bureaucracy depends on the extent to which these appointed officials have discretionary authority. So on your sheet, you have the definition for that. This is the extent to which an appointed bureaucrat can choose their course of action without those policies being spelled out in advance. Discretionary authority, especially at the top of the pyramid, has grown immensely since 1960. All right, so a bureaucrat is a person who works for the organization and has these defined duties and responsibilities. They are part of a precise division of labor within the organization. So for the federal government, you have political appointees plus civil service workers, all of them together, bureaucrats. 97% of them are career government employees. And a lot of that has to do with the benefits and the government pension and all of those things that you receive if you stick around. However, only 10% of bureaucrats live within the Washington, D.C. area. So most of them are serving in state and local agencies. 30% work for the Department of Defense. So nearly a million fall within the Department of Defense, while less than 15% work for social welfare agencies like the Department of Health and Human Services. All right, so demographics. When we look at the bottom of that iceberg, I had that iceberg drawn on the last page. That subsection of the bureaucracy, those people that aren't political appointees, look much like a cross-section of America from a demographic standpoint. In regards to social class, civil employees are far more diverse demographically than other government institutions like Congress. In terms of education, most of them are white collar workers, so they're secretaries, they're clerks, they're lawyers, they're inspectors, they're engineers, they're people with degrees or at least some on the job training. In regards to personal political beliefs, career bureaucrats look a little bit different than the American public. They're more likely to be liberal um, because there's job security within bigger government, right? And generally, like the Democratic Party or people who are more liberal are more in favor of a large government. And so there's some job security within voting Democratic. So that's one area that bureaucrats tend to be different. All right, on your sheet, you have all the characteristics and everything written down here. So you're just going to provide some examples. I'll read through a few. We have 4 different types of organizations within the bureaucracy. So you have the cabinet departments. These are headed by a cabinet secretary who's appointed by the president at the beginning of his term. They do need to be approved by the Senate, and these people should be experts within their policy area. Each cabinet has their own budget. So when Congress goes through and they make the budget, they allocate money by department or by agency, and then that department has to kind of figure out how they're going to spend the money or what the priority is going to be. So Congress isn't going line by line throughout the entire federal budget. They're giving cabinet departments a budget to work with. Now, if you want to cut spending or you want to cut programs as Congress, just cut a cabinet department's budget, right? If you want to cut spending on public education, don't give the Department of Education as much money to use for the fiscal year. So there are 15 total departments. You have the Department of Homeland Security, Commerce, Agriculture, Education, State. There's a ton of them. So you can look those up, but those would be some examples. Then we have independent executive agencies. So these are established by Congress, technically with a separate status outside of the executive branch. So the president doesn't have as much power within this realm. These agencies are given a specific mandate to perform some sort of usually service function rather than regulatory function, which we'll talk about next. So some examples would be like the Social Security Administration, the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA, even NASA would be an example of an independent executive agency. So you can see most of these examples end in an A for agency, right? Then you have independent regulatory commissions. Now, they're going to regulate a specific economic activity or interest, and they operate independently from Congress and the president. So much so that members cannot be removed without cause, and they serve really long terms. So they may serve like a 25-year term. And the only time a president gets to appoint someone new for that position is when another person retires. Couple examples would be the Federal Communication Commission. They're going to regulate public airwaves. So that's why network television, ABC, NBC, so on and so forth, they have a lot more rules about like language and content and violence, right? They even have different rules depending on the time of day, right? So that's why morning TV can't use the language that nighttime television can. And so the FCC is going to oversee that network television, where they're not going to so much oversee channels like Comedy Central, right? And then you have the Federal Reserve System. Federal Reserve System deals with the banking system, the money supply, interest rates, all of those things. And their board of governors sit for, I believe, nearly 20-year terms as well. The purpose of setting up an independent regulatory commission in this way is that they want them to be insulated from public pressure, and they do that by giving them long terms. And the last type is a government corporation. So this is essentially a government-owned business. It may or may not be profitable, but the purpose of it is to serve a public need. So the U.S. Postal Service is the largest. It is technically for profit, although that's been more challenging in recent years for them. Also, if you've taken the passenger train that goes through Fargo at like 3, 4 in the morning, Amtrak, that is also owned by the government. All right, we got just a few slides here left here, so we'll go through some of this pretty quick. I will post a link to the crash course video on controlling bureaucracies as well, because I think it does a better job of covering some of this stuff than I'm going to spend time on. So for many years, Congress used what was called a legislative veto to overturn bureaucratic action. They used it kind of as a check on the executive branch and the bureaucracy. The Supreme Court later finds this practice unconstitutional, so they no longer have that power. However, there are other things that they can do. Authorization, they have the power of the purse, right? They have the power to spend money and permit funds for given programs. And so if you don't allocate funds for a program, it's highly unlikely that that program's actually going to flourish because they need the money to operate it. So same sort of thing with appropriations. For oversight, Congress can do investigation of officials, right? They can subpoena individuals that work for the bureaucracy. If you remember the 2016 election, Congress subpoenaed Hillary Clinton based on her position as Secretary of State to talk about what had happened in Benghazi. So they can do that. They can play that oversight role. And then they do have legislative authority to some degree to pass laws that either limit or completely terminate an agency. It doesn't happen frequently, but I've seen them proposed. A couple of years ago, there was a bill to just eliminate the Department of Education. Didn't go anywhere, but there are those bills out there. On the president's side of things, they have appointment power, right? They select the department heads. They can issue executive orders and enforce them, right? And most of the time, executive orders are used to mandate something within the bureaucracy. They're often not like true legislative action. They oversee the Office of Management and Budget, so they can change an agency budget or require increased supervision or increased financial records, those sorts of things. And then they can also reorganize, so they can make the bureaucracy more cost effective or attempt to. And this has been tried by many presidents, as I mentioned, usually unsuccessfully. The Supreme Court, when it comes to the bureaucracy, has the power of judicial review. They can find executive actions unconstitutional or rule a policy unconstitutional as well. The media serves as the watchdog of democracy, right? Investigative journalism is there to pull out information about things that maybe shouldn't be happening. The Freedom of Information Act was passed by Congress. It allows you and I and the media to access government documents through public open records laws. So you can get your hands on those things that maybe the government wants to keep hidden. Last couple things here. The people sometimes get involved in interest groups, which attempt to influence rules and regulations, right? Pro-business interest groups like the Chamber of Commerce may be in favor of deregulating business a little bit. So they can attempt to influence that way. And then you have adversary culture. This is basically the ideology in which personal rights take central importance to our people. And so they're likely to fight back tooth and nail if government action were to go over or cancel their personal rights. All right. Now, trust in the government today is low, but most agencies are viewed relatively favorably. There are some problems, though, that the American people have with the bureaucracy. The first one, as we've already mentioned, red tape. These are the complex rules and procedures needed to accomplish tasks. The intention is to keep government equal and just, but too much paperwork can slow the process. So there's pros and cons there. All right, then we have conflict. Conflict is when we have rivalries between agencies with similar policies. So for example, the Egg Research Service tells farmers how to grow more effectively, while the Egg Stabilization and Conservation Group pays farmers to produce less, right? They'll give them a stipend if they use less of their land. So those agencies are in conflict with one another. And oftentimes that's a result of just inconsistent congressional action. You have duplication, which is also a result of inconsistent congressional action. This is when agencies perform the same or similar tasks. Waste, we have inefficient use of funding and manpower, right? Spending too much. In this picture you have on your screen, if you've watched Parks and Rec, you know that Ron Swanson is Leslie Knope's boss, and Leslie does it all, right? She's a crazy workaholic, and Ron kind of just chills, right? So within the bureaucracy, in that pyramid structure, there can be some inefficient use of manpower. And then we have imperialism. So this is the increase of an agency's power no matter the cost. And usually it's the result of having a worthy goal, right? But a big and vague goal too. The Department of Homeland Security is an example of this, right? Their goal is to prevent further terrorist attacks. Noble goal. How do you know if you've achieved it? So, all right, so you can see here kind of public views on different agencies. CDC, very favorable. We'll see how that goes after this whole coronavirus thing. And then the US Postal Service is not that highly liked. All right, last thing here is on control. So like I said, crash course video, I'll post, talks a little bit more about this. But who controls the bureaucracy today? Technically it is the executive, but it's heavily influenced by the public, interest groups, legislative action, judicial review, all of those things. So everyone plays a part. Reforming the bureaucracy is difficult because most of the rules and red tape are a result of struggle between the White House and Congress for control. Many of them are written for the public good, so there is an objective standard there. And they've designed these rules to avoid conflict. And so peeling them back proves to be challenging. Some potential effects of bureaucratic review or reform. what we've seen in the past is actually an increase of discretionary authority. So that can make bureaucracy more quick and more efficient, but it can also make bureaucracy too powerful. So that's a balance that we have to think about. Okay, perfect. 40 minutes. Let me know if you have questions. Shoot me a Schoology message, and I'll be in touch with other assignments videos.